Hello, and welcome to Emerging Viewpoints. I'm Nick Stadtmiller. Today we're joined by Dimitar Bechev to discuss Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's political journey through nearly 2 decades in power, the Turkish opposition's attempt to present a united challenge to Erdoğan and his AK Party in upcoming elections, and the significance of the Kurdish vote. Dr. Bechev is a lecturer at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and he's the author of Turkey Under Erdoğan, published this year by Yale University Press. Dimitar, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So your book takes a lot of time to discuss the political backdrop within Turkey before Erdoğan and the AK Party came to power, and the early years of the AK Party's rule, as well as what's changed in more recent years. And Erdoğan certainly has changed his image quite a bit over the last 2 decades. In the early years of the AK Party's rule, Erdoğan positioned his party as liberal and pro-European, albeit with conservative Islamic values. And more recently, Erdoğan has taken a much more nationalist stance, including forming an alliance between his AK Party and the ultranationalist MHP. Do you think these changes represent some underlying change in the political landscape within Turkey, or is this more a personal story of Erdoğan's transformation over the years?
I think it's the former, actually. When you write such a book, there's always the temptation to turn it into a personal biography of this one individual. And of course, Erdoğan has been extremely influential. He did shape the country in his image. But then again, Turkey, as you alluded in the opening, is a big and diverse place with various trends running at the same time, some of them contradictory, some of them complementary. And as much as Erdoğan has been the mover and shaker for this period of 20 years, he operates within a political system which is changing. It has undergone evolution. And that's why I chose sort of the mid to late 80s as a starting point, because a lot of what transpired later or developed as a trend, and which, of course, Erdoğan instrumentalized or had to adapt to, is a product of this longer evolution. So I think the overarching question is what accounts for his turnaround, which happened around 2008 to 2010. That's probably the critical period. Or was that a master plan? In other words, Erdoğan was always intent from day one to capture power and to become the overwhelming figure, the quasi-monarchical figure he is right now? Or is it the product of circumstances that actually he saw that that's the only viable strategy for him as a professional politician to prosper in this situation? I don't have a conclusive answer. It's a descriptive book, and I know this is it's a loaded question because there's a lot of blame going around in Turkey, including among some of my friends who have harsh words to exchange about their own positions 15 years ago or more. But I tend to believe that Erdoğan is much more of a contextual player, also intuitive. He didn't have a master plan. I mean, he's certainly an authoritarian personality. He's patriarchal, and he's not somebody who sort of is comfortable with sharing power. But at the same time, he has demonstrated time and again the pragmatic gene he's got, being able to react to circumstances, to build new coalitions. And one turning point was, of course, his decision to move towards the center, to the far right, his alliance with MHP, who, of course, as late as Gezi Park, were amongst his fiercest critics, and ultranationalists were present in those demonstrations. But Erdogan sensed that this is where the political dynamic is taking him, and he sort of abandoned his earlier coalition, which was very diverse. It included the Kurds, the liberals, the Western-leaning business lobbies, and so on and so forth, to build this coalition between Islamist conservatives and neutral nationalists. And of course, there were a lot of similarities and links and points of resonance between the two. But you cannot deny the agency of Erdogan in making it happen. So, yeah, I mean, it's looking forward. This means that Erdogan probably has lots of options on his plate to maneuver, even if he's now damaged goods, and a lot of people in the political system are smelling blood, and the opposition is after him, and there is a real sense that a turnaround is possible next year. But again, it's important to underscore my initial point, at the risk of going in circles in answering your question, that Erdogan is just one personality in a very complicated landscape in a country that has been rapidly changing since the 80s. And this book is as much about Erdogan as it about Turkey, and the contradictions and the possibilities, and all the sort of paths not taken in those 20 years, because there were a lot of squandered opportunities. Part of the tone of the book is the realization that we were in a much better place. Maybe we were naive 20 years ago in the early AKP days.
Well, I think one thing that would support your argument that there has been a shift in the political landscape in Turkey is the fact that Erdogan is not the only figure in Turkey that is adopting a nationalist stance. I mean, if you look at the opposition, the center-left CHP and the moderate nationalist, the EE party, they have used nationalist rhetoric to criticize Erdogan and his government, particularly on the issue of refugees and immigration policy. So could you talk us through the role of nationalist thought and nationalist rhetoric in Turkish politics, and how that matters in the upcoming election?
Well, absolutely. That's a very good point. I mean, nationalism is one variable that's always there in various shapes or forms. I mean, remember in 2007, around the whole mobilization against Erdogan, spearheaded by the People's Republican Party, how Erdogan was framed as the traitor, the one who was about to sort of betray Turkey and give away its sovereignty, and the opposition, then the secularists, they were epitomizing Turkish nationalism. So from a certain perspective, nationalism is a sort of meta language that everyone is instrumentalizing because it resonates with voters. And it's very flexible, because you can have a conservative version of nationalism. You certainly have the MHP ultra-nationalist variety, and then you have now the current opposition. Now the Syrian refugee issue is so much prevalent in public discourse. And a good starting point there, by the way, is the book that Jenny White published in 2014, looking at Turkish nationalism and the emergence of this conservative brand that AKP represents. But that doesn't mean that the opposition is any less nationalistic, and they'll use nationalist rhetoric as electoral strategy, especially in times of economic crisis, where you have voters' discontent channeled and explained through nationalist tropes. So I think the focus on Turkish nationalism in its varieties and permutations is essential. It's also essential, by the way, to understand or to think about your first question, why Turkey sort of diverted from the democratic path. Because at the end of the day, going back to Erdogan, I mean, he realized that all things being equal, European Union or non-European Union, democracy or non-democracy, one thing that is permanent in Turkish political life, and it works, is nationalist rhetoric. So Turkish nationalism and its resilience was part of the answer why Erdogan turned authoritarian. Not 100%, but it's certainly there. And ironically enough, Turkish nationalism might lead to his demise because the opposition, if they play their cards, might actually use nationalist rhetoric to galvanize political support to challenge the current regime.
That last comment is a good segue to talk about the opposition. Now, there are 6 major opposition parties that have banded together. 4 of those are in a formal nation alliance. But the 6 parties have had regular talks over the last few months to present some sort of unified opposition into the upcoming election. And it seems like the one thing that all 6 parties agree on is the desire to return to a parliamentary system of government. And it's unclear to me that they agree on much else. They've made very little progress in the area of, for example, a common economic policy. So, do you think that there is a chance for the opposition to coalesce ahead of these elections and actually present some sort of unified platform above and beyond this call for a return to the parliamentary system?
Well, so long as Erdogan is there, they can overcome their differences and band it together. And the silver lining in this situation is that over time, I think the opposition has learned how to cooperate and to overcome their differences to do with ideology or political orientation. But I think to me, the big issue is how the HDP, which is the 7th partner in this coalition that nobody dares to speak about, will position itself, because this is a swing constituency. That's what won the elections in 2018 in Ankara and Istanbul, the Kurdish vote. Now, HDP obviously will probably help this effort this time around, especially in the presidential race, because there's a big question mark who will be the headliner, who will be the common candidate. But longer term, and this, I agree with you that it's hard to sustain this almost unnatural grouping of Islamist conservatives, secularists, nationalists, and Kurdish, pro-Kurdish activists. Longer term, it will be difficult. And Erdogan knows that. I mean, he has been trying to drive a wedge. And the Kurdish issue is obviously something that is divisive. I mean, the EE party will find it hard to be seen as cooperating with the Kurds, even if now the Syrian refugees are the other. But Turkish nationalists across the spectrum suspect Kurdish separatism. A putative offensive in Syria against the YPG might lead to a sort of Kurdish issue re-entering the domestic arena and Erdogan politicizing it once again to expose this hidden partnership between the six-way coalition and the HDP. So for me, both short-term, this election, but also longer-term, the Kurdish issue is bound to be right, front and center in right, left, and center in Turkish politics, and it's absolutely essential for how this coalition will work. Because again, this is the tipping vote.
Well, this is a very interesting issue with the pro-Kurdish HDP. Polls show that they would probably get about 10 to 12% in the parliamentary race if the elections were held tomorrow. Currently, they're the 3rd largest party in parliament. And you've hinted that there's a sort of silent cooperation or behind the scenes cooperation, even if the other 6 opposition parties can't openly speak with the HDP. But do you think the HDP has any input into those coalition talks within the other 6 parties? Because specifically what I'm thinking about is the choice of a presidential candidate. Now, EE party leader Meral Akşener has said she doesn't want to run for president and that she would instead like to put her name forward for prime minister. But then you have Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who's head of the CHP. He gave a speech last week that seemed to reach out to Kurds and said that if he were elected, that he would free HDP leader Selahattin Demirtas, who's in prison. But is it possible for Kılıçdaroğlu and Akşener to walk this line where you have someone in the front who's saying conciliatory things to the Kurds, but also get that nationalist wing within the CHP or pretty much all of the EE party's base? I mean, is there a way that they can strike that balance to bring those votes on board without alienating the base?
Yeah, that's a tightrope situation. It requires lots of political jockeying to make it happen. But again, as long as the economic crisis is there, which obviously dominates priorities for the average person in Turkey, and as long as Erdogan is there to be the red rag uniting the opposition, I think they can just skirt the issue of the Kurds. But I think, again, longer term, it will be a problem. My sense is, without having any insight into the coalition dynamic, obviously, I sit far, far away on the other side of Europe. But my instinct is that the Kurdish movement probably will be a bit more comfortable with Kılıçdaroğlu. And that's not because of his Kurdish identity, and he's very shy about it. His Kurdishness. He never plays the identity card for obvious reasons, or his sectarian Alevi. In fact, it's the AKP which is likely to make a big issue of his being a minority politician deep down. But it's because he is likely to deliver on the commitment to bring Turkey back to the parliamentary system. There is a lingering suspicion around İmamoğlu. I mean, he's charismatic, he's full of energy, but the legitimate question is, once, if he becomes the president, if that's in the cards, because I think it's a big if I'm not sure Erdogan will surrender his position that easily. But suppose İmamoğlu becomes the next president, will he be comfortable in surrendering power and downgrading his position? A lot of people in Turkey are not convinced. And I'm sure the HDP is not convinced either. It's very likely that İmamoğlu might try to emulate Erdogan, try to use populism, maybe flirt with Turkish nationalism, and that's not a given. Whereas Kılıçdaroğlu will be a safer pair of hands, and he actually can restore a system which gives parliamentary parties, including the HDP, but also others, including EE party, much greater stake in the system, making the whole political process less majoritarian, but also much more pluralistic.
So I wanted to ask you, because you hinted earlier that Erdogan is likely to use the Kurdish issue as a divisive issue ahead of these elections. What do you expect from Erdogan and the AK Party going into these elections to maximize their own chances? And do you expect any maneuvers from the opposition side in order to push their cause as well?
I expect two things which are related. One is to shift the conversation from the economy to identity, which is generic to any populist movement these days. That kind of testifies that Turkey is hardly exceptional. It's a political system that resembles countries not to be named in the West as well. So Erdogan would rather not talk about the spiraling inflation, the cost of living, but talk about Turkishness, about minorities, about values, about Turkey in the world, and so on and so forth, about Islam, of course, to the extent that's possible. But shifting the conversation will give him some advantage, which is ironic again, because remember in the early days when the economy was, they keep his strong suit. I mean, they won lots of support beyond their hardcore because they were seen as the party which delivers on economic standards, on public policies, and so on and so forth. But right now, identity is the winning card for Erdogan. And secondly, and relatedly, bring foreign policy into the equation. Use foreign policy activism in order to boost the idea of Turkey as a rising power, as an important mediator in global politics. We see that now in the context of the war in Ukraine. Maybe use some of this divisive populist rhetoric that we saw in 2017, 2018, sort of denigrating Western European countries for backstabbing Turkey, not allowing Turkey to campaign there, just to incite anger and resentment against the West. Of course, that can be dialed down later on. So I expect all that. Certainly, connected to my last point, Erdogan will try to increase his support in the diaspora. So the diaspora vote, especially in countries like Germany, like the Netherlands, Austria, France to some degree, will matter because in a neck and neck competition with the opposition, every vote counts, and the AKP has an advantage in diaspora communities. So these are the things that I see happening, or it's rational to expect that Erdogan will be zooming in on in the coming months as the race comes near.
I think one thing that a lot of foreign observers of Turkey assume is that because of the condition of the economy and the mismanagement, the loss of independence of the central bank, spiraling inflation, that this is obviously, in the eyes of foreign observers, or most foreign observers, this is obviously going to hurt Erdogan significantly in the election. But when I talk to people inside of Turkey, the one sense of frustration that I hear from people who sympathize with the opposition is that somehow the opposition is not able to capitalize on that issue, and they're able to bring it into a talking point for a few weeks and then it kind of disappears. And I think the best example of that is back in 2019 and 2020 when the central bank was spending FX reserves massively to try to prop up the currency. It eventually ended in tears and $120 billion was gone. And the opposition started this, where's the 120 billion? And that was really popular for a few months. And then it just seems like it got forgotten. So my question to you is, do you think the opposition can make the economy stick as an issue in this campaign and use that to their advantage?
I'm optimistic. I think they will be able, because it's a low-hanging fruit at the end of the day. It's not an abstract issue. It affects pretty much everyone because everyone has to make their ends meet and there's the bills to pay. So this does resonate. I mean, there's an issue about salesmanship, who will be conveying the message, whether the opposition can make a case that they're better economic managers, because we don't know that. Just the AKP has been around for such a long time. But I have no doubt that they'll do their best to bring the conversation there, and to try to convince as many people. To me, the main issue is what happens the day after the election. Say the opposition brings the economy into the conversation, they win by some margin, but Erdogan refuses to surrender power, which is a real option because so realistically there is no alternative. If you step down in this controlled political system, you see a risk for all the power, all the resources, all the networks you accumulated over those years. In a situation where the rule of law is undermined, the courts and the legal system is no guarantee for a former leader. And the other option would probably be exile. So pressed against the wall, it's very likely that Erdogan will be fighting, and he might call the elections, call into question the elections' legitimacy, maybe even rig the elections on the margins. So in order for the opposition to win in this unequal asymmetric situation where there is no level playing field, you have to win by a very big margin. And I'm not sure that's happening. Of course, now the surveys suggest that's possible, but as there's 1 year to go, pretty much. So my fear is that it will be a narrow victory and it will be questioned. There might be a rerun, and Turkey might be in for a period of turmoil. And eventually Erdogan will cling to power no matter what, because any alternative is unpalatable for him.
Well, you bring up a very good point, which is I think that the election is probably a lot closer than many observers believe. And you point out that Erdogan probably has a lot of options. But the other question is, even if he does accept the results of the election, they may not be all bad for him. For example, he could lose his majority in parliament or his coalition's majority, and he could hold the presidency himself. There are, other possibilities. Maybe he loses the presidency, but AKP becomes an indispensable partner within parliament. So, do you think that there's any path for political stability within Turkey without Erdogan or the AKP being part of the picture?
Yeah, I was thinking at some point that a cohabitation scenario where the opposition actually captures parliament, but Erdogan stays in the presidency. It's an option, but now the figures don't suggest that that's possible. But again, we have all those surveys with a pinch of salt. But suppose that happens, that they're partial gains by the opposition, they don't get the presidency. I think that's a recipe for disaster, to use the French term cohabitation, because there'll be a lot of legal wrangles. There'll be vetoing of legislation. The battle will be taken to the courts, with the constitutional court playing a role. There will be a paralysis in the system and a lot of polarization. The other scenario where actually AKP still stays indispensable might materialize as well, and that could prove as well a recipe for disaster, because the shaky coalition between those six parties, or whatever formation gets into parliament, will be exposed without Erdogan in the presidential office. And there'll be infighting within the parliament, but also between parliament and presidency. So, I mean, it's very likely it will get much, much worse before it gets better in Turkey. So the combination of political fragmentation and economic crisis, plus obviously a war next door, doesn't look very good to me. Almost reminds me of the 1990s, because we remember that the book starts with this parallel that in many ways, when Erdogan came to power, he suggested that the AKP era of stability was the antidote to what he had experienced before in this lost decade. But in a funny way, we went full circle. Turkey went full circle, and now a lot of things domestically, but also in foreign policy, a lot of phenomena and problems have re-emerged, almost as if we are back into this decade of marked instability. So that's what I think will happen in the next couple of years.
We'll have to leave it there for now. But Dimitar, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.